Good. The main subject I'm talking about today is a citizen science project that operates within our West Australian Fairy Tern Conservation Network. But in order to put this in the context, the citizen science project actually is part of a wider activity, which is the operation of a conservation network. I'll talk a little bit initially about the network itself. Many years ago I was invited to the east to talk about small tern conservation, and at that stage the Australian Fairy Tern was not a listed species. At that meeting it was decided that following the events in South Australia with the decline in the Coorong and the decline in the eastern fairy tern population, that it should be listed. And then many years passed and nothing happened, which is a common story. Eventually I got sick of being cornered at conferences, people saying, "Oh, we have a problem with our fairy terns, what do we do?" And I decided, well, about time we developed a strategic approach to the issues around fairy tern conservation in Western Australia. And we started moving towards developing a conservation network. Why have a network? Well, we're dealing here with a species which is a relatively small population breeding over a very large geographical area, from effectively in terms of breeding distribution from the eastern Pilbara right through to the West Australian border, the edge of the Bight. But relatively small numbers of individuals, that the issues with conservation are not restricted. In fact, the minority of them would be occurring on conservation estate. So it's not a problem that can be solved in our conservation network. It has to be solved wherever the problem occurs. So we set up a network with a number of goals. One is to actually provide that strategic thinking about the conservation of this species as a whole, rather than issues that crop up in different places all the time. To develop a network for community surveillance, so we actually know what's going on in various places. Where necessary, to take remedial action when the colonies, for example, appearing in inappropriate locations and require rapid deployment of people and signage and other things to protect colonies. To do more strategic conservation projects, and I won't have time to talk about those today, but at the moment we have 4 projects going on in Western Australia which are about establishing and managing managed areas for fairy terns, which is probably one of the major strategies that we have long term for conservation. And then lastly is to use the network as a way of facilitating a citizen science project. So what we have is a threatened species population. It occurs in both southeastern and southwestern Australia, but the vast majority of the birds are actually in Western Australia. They're spread over a very large spatial area. The listing advice gives us somewhere between 5 and 10,000 individuals. We're pretty confident now that we have more birds than that, so from our point of view we think there's probably at least 6,000 individuals and possibly more breeding in Western Australia. There are multiple threats. The most common threat that we face is disturbance of birds trying to breed on the coastline, either on beaches or on the mainland or on islands. Predators in those situations, and also potentially marine threats, including changes in fish stocks and marine contamination issues. We're dealing with multiple jurisdictions, and that's why it's better to have a network. It's not the sort of thing that the conservation agency can deal with itself. Largely they are restricted to doing things on lands and waters for which they have responsibility, but fairy tern breeding colonies occur in all sorts of places. They do occur on nature reserves and national parks. They control in areas that are managed by Fisheries Department, by port authorities, by Rottnest Island Authority, Swan River Trust, local governments, Defence Department, which is really interesting to have a network that involves the Defence Department, who are sworn to secrecy on just about everything. So sharing information can be interesting. Even mining and petroleum companies sometimes have issues with fairy terns, as do land developers. And we also have potentially a whole range of people who can participate in conservation action. Of the obvious suspects like BirdLife WA, the NRM and coastal groups. The NRM councils have actually been very helpful in the establishment of this network, initially through state NRM, and then recently we've done very well out of the NAC coastal program closing down SAIL in terms of resources towards the network. Even commercial recreational fishers. We're now working in other projects with four-wheel drivers, and a lot of people who engage in activities that affect fairy terns are actually looking for the sorts of conditions that fairy terns are looking for. A typical situation is tombolos along the coast, where you have sandbars reaching out to islands or reefs. Also the main focus of attention of windsurfers and kite surfers and other people because of the wind angles you get in those situations. So direct conflict often occurs. Boat users are a major source of disturbance on offshore islands. Tour businesses may interact with birds both in positive and negative ways. This is our current understanding of the Australian fairy tern. It's the Australian subspecies of this bird. There are two other subspecies. One is in New Zealand, which I think last I heard was down to about 4 pairs, which shows what can happen with these sorts of birds. There's another about 100 pairs in New Caledonia. Both those populations are regarded as different subspecies, and then there's the Australian one, which occurs in southeastern and western Australia. The genetic work that was done some years ago by some New Zealanders indicated that the genetic diversity of the birds in Western Australia is quite a lot higher than the genetic diversity in the southeast. So what that tends to imply is that West Australia is the source population for fairy terns, and that they have colonised areas to the east over time, and the lower genetic diversity in the east is a result of the founder effect of the smaller number of individuals that's founded those populations in eastern Australia. In Western Australia, we have migratory or partial migratory population of birds in the southern part of the state, certainly from the south coast and the lower west coast. But exactly what's happening beyond the lower west coast is something that we're still looking at, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we also have winter breeding populations in Shark Bay and on the Pilbara coast, which are small and sedentary and not involved in any major movements as far as we can see. So what we have over this wide distribution is populations that have quite a variation in the timing of breeding. From the southwest populations, which tend to have colonies anywhere between October and March, and that goes both for the south coast and for the lower west coast. But within that, we have groups of birds that are on different reproductive cycles. So even within southwestern Australia, we have birds coming in and out of breeding condition at different times, which means you actually have different components of the population breeding in different months. Typically in terns, that may be the result of age structure, where the younger proportion of the population breed in later groups than early, but it's also possible, as happens in many situations, that local conditions allow birds' breeding cycles to become entrained with local foraging conditions, which means that those differences in timing are perpetuated over the long term. And then in the north and in Shark Bay, we have winter breeding population, which where you have nesting between June and August. And then we even have spring breeding, early spring breeding up on the Ningaloo coast, which is neither of those, but likely those birds are also sedentary. So if you look at a flock of fairy terns in midwest or southwestern Australia, you may well see considerable variation in breeding condition, and that's because you have adult birds in that flock or whatever that are different breeding periodicities. Seabirds typically, because they are phylopatric and breed in colonies, tend to have a layered population structure, which stratifies the population into birds that have colonies that have a high proportion of exchange between other colonies, and then as you move up through the different hierarchical levels, you have a lower and lower probability of gene flow between the different levels. Species like the Australian Fairy Tern, which is what we call a area fidelity species. In other words, individuals don't return to the same precise nest site from year to year like some things do, but they do tend to return to the same area, and usually the case that is a natal area, where a particular individual was reared. Important from a conservation point of view to understand the population structure, because where you divert your efforts in terms of protecting colonies may or may not be particularly significant in the overall picture, and you need to know exactly what contribution your colonies are making to the overall population and gene flow in the population. So that's the sort of model that we look at, and particularly relevant part of it for most of us is down at the bottom, where we have a layer of structure that we call neighbourhoods. These are groups of birds that breed, assemble to breed in pre-breeding flocks, and from those breeding flocks you may have a variety of colonies established, but the actual fundamental unit of the population is the neighbourhood, not the colony. So colonies can appear and disappear, not necessarily affecting the population. What happens at the neighbourhood level, though, is quite important to local conservation. If you lose the neighbourhood, you lose the birds, basically. So that's the level that you need to be thinking about. But that means you may well have a range of alternatives when it comes to which areas you want to manage for colonies, and which ones may be more defensible for that purpose. Now, to get to the citizen science project itself, it begins with banding, and in the last few years that has involved a number of A-class banders and a whole gaggle of trainee banders, and they're all girls, so we call them the bandettes, and they have been working on getting significant proportion of the population marked as just over 1,000 now, which are marked in Western Australia. We ban both breeding adults on the edge of colonies, and we also do most of our adult banding at night roosts, where there's very little risk of significant disturbance, and then we also ban cohorts of chicks from colonies. Now, one of the changes in the way people do birding these days is that you don't see people walking around with binoculars so much. You see them walking around with digital cameras with huge lenses, and that offers a number of opportunities for us, increasing the return rate on the birds banded, so we don't have to rely on recapturing them to get good information. So we colour band individuals mainly at night roosts on migration at the Abrolhos, but also in some cases at colonies, and of course we metal band. Now that photo on the right was taken by an observer with her camera. She was 10 metres away on a footpath, and we were able with her equipment to actually read the numbers on the band, and it was an old band. It was 20 years old as well, so quite remarkable what's possible with this technology. The network invites people to send in those kind of observations and also photographs of colour-banded individuals. And because we've got photographs, we can also look at the age and molt state, so we get a lot more additional information about what we're talking about. So the bird on the left is a bird banded on migration at the Abrolhos, got blue bands, and we can tell from the plumage that it must have been banded in its first year, because that's a 1 year bird now down in the Peel Harvey inlet, sort of 400 odd kilometres further south. So quickly, sort of data we get, we've got longevity data now. We know that we have fairy terns in our population that are 20 years old and breeding in the same areas that they originally came from. We have known age recaptures on migration, so that we know that birds from the southwest move up to the Abrolhos Islands in the autumn, and from there, a bit of a question. We now know that fairy terns were breeding in their second year, so we've got an idea age of first breeding, and that some are returning to the colony at which they were banded, and others to other nearby colonies in the same neighbourhood, but not movements over a wider area. We have known age recruits to colonies that are not the original colonies, but generally speaking, helping us to define where the neighbourhood is in terms of the exchange of individuals between colonies. These are some of the migratory movements. These are post-fledging movements from a breeding colony in Perth during the summer. These are movements up from Perth to the Abrolhos Islands of known age birds. These are movements of colour marked birds from the Abrolhos back down into the southwest each year. We've done 3 expeditions up into the north looking for whether or not our southern birds actually move into Shark Bay or onto the Pilbara coast. So far the answer is we don't think so. And recently we've discovered that we have quite significant wintering populations not very far north of Perth on the mid-west coast, which may explain why we're not seeing them in the north. So what have we learnt so far from the citizen science component? Well, fairy terns do return to breed in their natal areas, but they may be at a number of colony sites within a neighbourhood. They can start breeding in their second year. They live for at least 20 years and stay in those natal areas. The lower southwest population do move north into the Midwest at least, and we have quite high aggregations at the Abrolhos in autumn, up to 3,000 individuals in one place, which is a very large proportion of the known population. We have at least migratory flocks wintering in some of the birds at least, whether that's a colony specific thing or a general thing, in the Midwest region during the winter. And we have no evidence so far that southern birds are moving up into the tropical areas. Thank you. And we have a new edition of the West Australian Fairy Tern Conservation Guide. If anyone would want one, there's some on the table, and if we run out, let me know and we can let you have them.
We've got some time for some questions. Does anyone have any questions for Nic before we move on to the next person?
Nic, you've been doing really good work with creating new habitats for the fairy terns. Would you like to talk about that a bit exactly, and how positive are you feeling about that? Is that something we should be replicating in other places along the south coast?
Managed sites in populated areas is probably the only show in town in the long term. And managed sites are areas that are protected by fencing and other measures, and where we actually engineer the use of those areas by the birds by using decoys and sound recordings and other things to establish a pattern of use. In situations where we have 2 of them now, there are actually no longer any physical space left for the birds other than the managed sites. So if you're going to keep those neighbourhoods intact, then there's the only way you can do it. So, we have managed sites that we assist with the Fremantle Port Authority and the container port, which incidentally is our most successful colony in Western Australia that we know about at the moment in terms of chick production. It has a truck going past every 15 seconds. It has a bicycle path down the side. It has people walking past all day. It has floodlit at night. And yet those birds can quite happily adapt to that situation, providing you have that intensive level of management and protection. We've got a similar site down in the breakwall at Mandurah, where the last breeding site there was built on last couple of years ago, and we're hoping to attract birds to that. Rottnest Island, there are birds nest in a lot of inappropriate places, and we're focusing on an island in the Salt Lakes which we think we can protect. And we have managed to attract birds to there last season, and down in the south coast at the mouth of the Wilson Inlet, there's a dredge spoil island there that we are co-opting for the purposes of creating a managed site down there. So those sort of projects show a lot of promise, and the Rouse Head site has been very important because it's enabled us to band entire cohorts of chicks each year, which gives us a way of measuring survivorship and movements and natal recruitment and all those sorts of things from a particular colony. It has a really big advantage that because it has a chick-proof fence around it, that at the end of the breeding session we can herd every chick up into one corner and band the whole lot every year, which is so as the bandettes will tell you, that's a great night out. So some of you might want to come along at some point. Is that enough for you?
Yeah, we've got time for one more question.
You'll have to yell.
Nic, how large is Rouse Head? How large an area?
Spatial area?
Yeah.
It would be, it's about 150 metres long, maybe by 40, 50 metres wide, not very big. We'd like it to be bigger, and that neighbourhood also includes the birds that breed on the island at Point Walter. And that island is vegetating quite quickly, so it may become unusable at some point. So we would like more space at Rouse Head, but we are getting movement of birds between the two. In fact, it's quite likely that the sandspit at Point Walter is the club site where all the pre-breeding activity for the whole neighbourhood occurs, and then they set up colonies in different locations. Rouse Head being the main one, but yeah, that's about the minimum area really. The one at Mandurah, we're struggling with it not quite being big enough. But
Great, thank you very much, Nic.